Let's pick up where we left off in this greatest of stories, following Jesus through his final days in Jerusalem, learning alongside the disciples that his blood must be poured out for many, and that the good news of his resurrection must be proclaimed to the whole world. Join us as we journey with Jesus to the cross and beyond the Gospel of Mark.
Hi, everyone. Recently, I came across a fascinating study about what most people regret at the end of their lives. And you might expect the top answers to be, about working too much or not taking enough vacations or missing out on opportunities. But surprisingly, one of the most common regrets was this: I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Now, here's what's interesting. When researchers dug deeper into what people meant by living true to myself, they discovered something counterintuitive. The moments people felt most authentically themselves weren't when they were, pursuing their own happiness or comfort. Instead, it was the moments of radical sacrifice, when they gave everything they had for something or someone that they believed in. See, this longing is universal to the human spirit. Hunger for this kind of meaning is everywhere. These days, more and more people are classifying themselves as spiritual, but not religious, reporting that they're seeking ultimate meaning through things like personal meditation and mindfulness and other means of self-directed spiritual exploration. Many younger people pointed to relational belonging as being their primary way to discover meaning. Acceptance by certain peer groups is a very powerful force. Others are turning to activism like environmental advocacy and racial justice and other social issues to find a tangible sense of purpose. And here's the deal. We all want something worth going all in for, something or someone so valuable that we'd willingly pour out our best for it. And so today we're going to look at a story about a woman who did exactly that. She walked into a dinner party 2,000 years ago, and she did something so extravagant, so scandalous, that people are still talking about it today. And in her story, we're going to discover something profound about what makes a life truly meaningful. We're going to see how to recognize and respond to the worth of Jesus. In fact, what if the very thing you're afraid to surrender is the thing holding you back from what you really want? We're continuing our journey through Mark today. We're going to pick things up in chapter 14, and so if you want to get there, find your way there. But I want to set the stage before we read our text today in Mark 14. So one of the themes of this gospel that we've been noticing is called discipleship failure. We see the disciples of Jesus again and again failing to get it. There'll be no less than 5 examples of this discipleship failure in just chapter 14 alone. And I think it gives us all hope that the 12 humans that Jesus chose to invest his mission in were so flawed. And so yes, God uses very ordinary and sinful people to accomplish his purposes. This should give us all hope. But today's failure is one of the biggest of all as we first learn about Judas's treacherous betrayal of Jesus. But coupled with these instances of discipleship failure, that there's almost always an ordinary hero that emerges. Often a very minor, sometimes even nameless character that shows us a picture of true discipleship. And that's what is going to happen today with a woman who's known in Mark's gospel only as the woman from Bethany. This is a reminder that Christianity is not for the religious elite. It is a movement of ordinary folks. It's a path for all of us. Now, today, we also have an example of what we've called the sandwich technique. Mark does it a lot. It's where he embeds a story inside of a bigger story to really enhance the meaning of his main point. It's his way of making sure that we don't miss it. And so today, the story of the woman at Bethany's anointing Jesus with her perfume is in the middle of the chief priests on the front end plotting to kill Jesus, and Judas on the back end plotting to betray Jesus. And so between a plot to kill and a plot to betray is this incredible act of surrender. And Mark is clearly drawing our attention to really a question. What is Jesus worth to you? Because to the murderers, he's worth nothing. They're ready to off him. And to Judas, his betrayal is worth a handful of pieces of silver. But to this woman, Jesus is worth everything she could find to sacrifice for him, including a very expensive bottle of perfume. But more than that, her reputation and even her very life. My big idea today is this. It's surrendering to Jesus is worth whatever sacrifice it may cost. See, the scene opens in Bethany. It's just a few miles outside Jerusalem. The triumphal entry has already happened. Lazarus' death and resurrection has already happened. And there's a bounty on Jesus' head. Everyone who associates with Jesus is a marked man. But here they are at a dinner party at the home of a man named Simon the leper, which means this guy had leprosy, a disease that would have left him to die alone as a social outcast. And he'd obviously been healed by Jesus, and now he's hosting a dinner party. Why wouldn't you? And we get some details from other gospel accounts on who else is there besides the 12 and Simon. Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, were there. And there's another group of people there. So it's a collection of people. I mean, can you imagine being there? Like, look around the table. You see Simon the leper. He starts off by saying, hey, guys, look at my skin. Like, I had leprosy. I was considered unclean with no human contact for years because I was quarantined. And Jesus changed my life. And then Peter's next, and he chimes in. I was a foul-mouthed fisherman who walked on water. And around the table we go, story of life change after life change. And then Lazarus, who's been sitting quietly, finally chimes in. And he's like, that's great and all, but, I was dead a couple days ago. Can somebody pass the carrots? What a night, what a collection of people, what stories of adventure they had lived with Jesus. And guys, we still gather around tables like this, and I pray that more and more our conversations could turn to tales of the adventure of following Jesus. But then something shocking happens. The story goes silent, and this woman who had experienced the grace of God firsthand decides to express her devotion to Jesus so beautifully that it gave her a lasting legacy. And so I want to read the account to you. It begins with murder, it ends in betrayal, but in the middle of this sandwich technique, an act of surrender showing the true worth of Jesus. And so join me in Mark chapter 14, verse 1. It says, it was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at a table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. And she broke the flask and she poured it over his head. And there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you. And whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. And then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. So I want to frame the message this way today from our text. It's how to respond to the true worth of Jesus. Here's the first thing I want you to see. It's to make Jesus the highest value that shapes everything else. We're told here that the woman broke this flask of a very expensive perfume. Verse 5 said it was worth 300 denarii. It's about a year's wages. I checked, the median income from 2024 in the U.S. is about $59,000. And so this is like a $50,000 bottle of perfume. Certainly the most costly thing this woman owned. By contrast, Judas, who plays an interesting role in this story, he left the dinner party and he sold Jesus and sold his own soul for 30 denarii, 1/10 of the value of the bottle of perfume. Again, we're supposed to be noticing this idea of worth. This wasn't a spontaneous act by this woman. She must have planned for this moment. She must have anticipated it in advance and decided prior to coming to the dinner that she was going to bring this expensive gift to the table. And notice the disciples didn't object to the anointing itself. They didn't object to the perfume. What they objected to is the extravagance, the value of the gift. But Jesus disagreed. What she has done, he said, is lovely. Her act of surrender had an aesthetic value. It was like a beautiful work of art, a beautiful piece of music, a beauty that defied cost analysis. I think about David in the Old Testament who had the opportunity to acquire the space and supplies to build an altar to the Lord for free. And he says, I won't sacrifice to the Lord that which costs me nothing. And so I'd ask you, how many of you are trying to live out your faith for free? To be a Christian in a way that doesn't cost you anything. Is there something in your life that's become more valuable to you than Christ? A possession, a relationship, a reputation, an accomplishment? A year's wages poured out in a moment. And to the disciples, it was wasteful. To the woman, it revealed what she valued most. And the truth is, whatever sits at the top of your value system will naturally shape every decision that comes below it. And so today, I would urge you to examine your calendar, examine your bank statements. These are tells. Just look at the last month. They tell an honest story about what you truly value most. If Jesus isn't showing up at that level as your highest priority, you have to ask, what needs to change? Here's the second way to respond to Christ's worth, is to break your backup plans. Do you see that in verse 3? It says, she broke the flask. It was customary as a sign of honor and respect to pour maybe a few drops of perfume on a special guest at a dinner party. To have poured a handful of this perfume would have been considered an extravagant act, but the whole room probably gasped when they heard the crash of the bottleneck on the table as this act of worship and devotion became a no turning back moment. I don't know if any of you have had any experience with broken perfume bottles. Years ago, I had a bottle of cologne break in a suitcase as it was being tossed around the tarmac by some well-meaning baggage handlers at the Detroit airport. Needless to say, one of those bottles, when it's broken, there's no reclaiming the contents of a bottle of perfume. The breaking of the bottle is an act of finality. That perfume is never going back in there. It's a no turning back moment. And Mary had this decision. Will I dab the perfume? Will I pour some of the perfume out in my hand, even pour it over Jesus' head? But it makes quite a statement when you break the bottle. What's with that? Well, I think she was aiming for extravagance. She wasn't thinking, what's the least I can do? How much of this, can I give that'll be considered enough and then keep the rest for myself? What's my bare minimum obligation? What's the entry level requirement? That's how we think sometimes. We think that when it comes to our faith, what's the least I can do? But breaking the alabaster jar, she withheld nothing from Jesus. It was all out on the table, no turning back. I want to challenge those of you who may be straddling the fence in your relationship with God. Maybe you're pouring out a little commitment here, a little devotion there. Usually those half measures are just fear in disguise. Man, can I challenge you just to go all in, to throw yourself wholeheartedly into following Jesus the Master? When Julius Caesar landed his army in Britain, he made their mission clear in one unforgettable act. He burned their ships that they'd arrived in. And as men watched their only means of retreat going up in flames, they understood that there was no going back, only forward. And some of you today are like those soldiers standing on the shore of surrender, eyeing your escape routes. But real transformation begins when we burn the ships. What safety net do you need to set fire to today? Maybe there's some little sins or habits that you retreat to when things aren't going as planned. Some of you have been dabbling for too long. A little religion here, a little church attendance there. A little moral behavior here, an occasional prayer there. Claiming faithfulness to Christ when it's convenient and denying him when it's not. To you I say, it's time for a risky, reckless, bottle-smashing moment. What's your backup bottle? That thing that you're keeping just in case God doesn't come through. Name it, and then ask yourself, what does breaking that bottle look like in your life today? Here's the third way to respond to the worth of Jesus. It's to let criticism of others confirm your scandalous conviction. It didn't deter her, it just confirmed her conviction. And as she broke in the bottle and poured out some on Jesus' head, without pretense, she did something equally scandalous. She brushed away the shards of broken glass from the floor so that she had a place to kneel. And in John's account, he tells us that she would have to reach up, take off her head covering, which women were forbidden to do in public, unwind her hair, empty the rest of the contents of the bottle on Jesus' feet, and humbly use her hair to wipe it, her tears mingling with the perfume. The passage says that some of those in the room became indignant. Another translation of the word is that they began snorting. You see, genuine surrender to Jesus will always look excessive to those watching from a safe distance. It's hard to be in the room when somebody is sold out like that. And people's immediate reaction to true devotion is to criticize, is to judge them, is to say they're going too far. And somehow this makes us feel better about ourselves, to call someone crazy or to think of more spiritual ways that they could have used their perfume money. Mary knew that this act wasn't going to be a big hit in the room. And apparently she didn't care much. Her love for Christ allowed her to block out the criticism of the others. See, Mary gave more than perfume to Jesus. She gave him her reputation. I'm reminded of Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 2. He says, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please men, but God who tests our hearts. You can understand why the disciples were so upset. Mary had taken her entire life savings and completely wasted it, according to them. The Bible says that their jaws dropped to the floor and they rebuked her harshly. In other words, they let her have it. What in the world are you thinking, lady? Are you crazy? That was about the dumbest thing I think I've ever seen. Can't you hear him? Think of all the really spiritual things that you could have done with that money, lady. Now it's just spilled perfume on the floor. It's okay to express a little love for Jesus, but let's not go overboard here. What a waste. And I imagine that they were waiting for Jesus to back them up, like hoping that he would pull out one of those gotcha quotes that he used on the Pharisees all the time. This would be the perfect time to pull out one about good stewardship or something along those lines. They just know that he's going to have a doozy for her. Her wasteful enthusiasm needs to be tamed. And Jesus had something to say for her, all right, but it wasn't for the woman. It was for the disciples. Leave her alone, said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. It appears to me that we have conflicting views of extravagance. One view is that extravagance is wasteful. The other view is that it's an expression of love. You need to know that when you sacrifice something for Jesus like this woman did, not everyone is going to see it as a good thing. And so I ask you, when was the last time that your faith caused you to do something that others would view as scandalous, but that God would view as a beautiful offering? Here's the fourth way to respond to the worth of Christ, is to offer what you have in timely moments of surrender. I want you to see this little phrase in verse 8. Jesus says, she has done what she could. Literally, it means what she had, she did. What she had, she did. And I'm so encouraged by this little phrase because it reminds me that God only requires the mundane stuff that we have be offered to him. She demonstrates that it's enough to give God what you can. Well, what's $50,000 to God? Do you think he needs that? Do you think he was like, I was running low on perfume? No. But to that woman, it meant surrender. It meant everything. And at the end of your life, when you stand before God, you're not going to be answering for someone else's life. You're not going to answer for how someone else, used what was given to them. You're only going to answer for what was entrusted to you by God. And so if you're deciding, what does surrender look like for you? Ask simply, what do I have? No matter how ordinary, God has a history of using ordinary things and using them for his extraordinary purposes. Remember when God and Moses were having their original negotiation at the burning bush, and Moses was trying to talk God out of using a guy like him because of all the skills he didn't have and all the talents he didn't possess. And do you remember what God asks him? God looks at Moses and he says, what's that in your hand? It's more like, what do you got there? And Moses says, it's just an ordinary shepherd's staff. And God says, throw it on the ground. And that staff would serve to remind Moses that if God can turn a stick into a snake and back into a stick again, then surely he can do something with a stuttering murderer who got his start in a floating basket. Or how about this? You typically don't want to send a shepherd boy to battle against a giant. But Saul was out of options. And so, he tried to suit up little David like a little Rambo. And instead, David's like, I got to get out of this. He took 5 stones and an ordinary leather sling, and God made his point. Or what about the little boy that Jesus discovered in the face of a hungry and restless crowd? And the disciples had, run the numbers. They knew they couldn't feed this many people, but they were looking at what they didn't have. And Jesus was focusing on what they did have. A loaf of some fish, and that little brown bag lunch became a feast for a crowd that would fill Veterans Stadium in downtown Erie. And over again, the mundane becomes majestic. The ordinary becomes divine. What's that in your hand? And so many people refuse to surrender because they're focused on what they don't have. I don't have the education. I don't have the training. I don't have the money or the experience or the position, or I don't have the guts. And God says, you're looking at the wrong thing. What's in your hand? Just surrender to me what you do have. And we're going to do something great together, something supernatural. And Jesus says to the scoffer, she's done what she could. What she had, she did. But I want you to circle back for just a moment to what what they were scoffing about, because this phrase that Jesus says is hard to understand without thinking it through. And so look again at verse 6. He says, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing for me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me." What does that mean? Well, let me be crystal clear. Jesus isn't letting us off the hook from caring for the poor. Okay, I've heard this verse flippantly used to justify, why the church doesn't need to get involved in social issues in our communities. That is not what Jesus is saying here, okay? He's saying very specifically to this group of people that there are things, the chance to do, which only come once. This was the last time that this group got to be with Jesus. Her gift was perfectly timed. And Jesus acknowledges in verse 8 that she was actually anointing him for burial. Like, the beauty of this story is that the woman had one chance to anoint Jesus in this way, and she seized it. If she'd thought about it for too long, she would have had a lovely bottle of perfume for herself that would have probably lasted for many years into the future. She would have smelled pretty at parties and weddings. She may have even sold it later in life to donate some food to a homeless shelter. But she would have missed the opportunity to be the person that God himself brags about to all of humanity. See, far from telling us to disregard the poor or to live self-indulgently, Jesus is pointing us to seizing timely opportunities to surrender to him, to make the most of the opportunities that come your way. Like when you have a chance to show love to God in an extravagant way, break a vase. There's a great tragedy among Christians today, and it's the tragedy of missed opportunities. Some of you may never again have. There are some of you who are in a window of opportunity right now that you may never get again. Like there's a situation at work, or maybe a relationship you're in, or a personal struggle that you're going through, where a bold act of surrender to Christ could make all the difference. Seize the day. Don't miss the opportunity. Maybe you're at an age or a stage of life that has opened opportunities that you may never have again. Maybe you're at a stage of a relationship or a circumstance that took a turn that you didn't see coming. Or you're going through a personal struggle and you have the chance right now for an extravagant act of surrender. What opportunity is in front of you right now that you've been waiting to be more ready for? What if today is your alabaster jar moment? Here's the fifth way to respond to the true worth of Jesus. It's to let Christ's story become your story. There are so many examples of phrases in the New Testament that reinforce this idea. Paul says, "I'm crucified with Christ, so I no longer live, but Jesus Christ now lives in me. My story has been enveloped in his story." Or he tells the church in Colossae, "For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God." Your story has been merged into his story. And so that's the theology of it. But what we see in this story, this really beautiful kind of symbolic example, that if you will use your imagination just a little and enter the story, I want you to see this for a moment. See, in so many ways, this woman becomes like a picture of Christ and what he's about to do on the cross for mankind. Just look at her surrender. Look at her sacrifice. Look at her brokenness. Look at her receiving ridicule and condemnation. And so in this act of surrender, she's becoming almost a type of Jesus, a picture of what's to come. But there's another thing about the story that's always intrigued me, and it's about the perfume. So we know from the story that it was a particularly pungent fragrance. It filled the whole house with its aroma. And we get the sense that by the end of the account, both Jesus and this woman are covered head to toe in perfume. Jesus says in verse 8, "She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare me for burial." And so as we piece together the details from all the different accounts, it was poured on his head, it was poured on his body. We know from John's account, it was poured on his feet, it was in her hair. So they're both covered with this perfume. And remember, this event happens in the final days of Jesus' life on earth. And I've always wondered if that pungent fragrance didn't stay on him all the way to the cross. Like that fragrance would go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prayed and cried in agony the day before he died. It would go to the court of the high priest, where Jesus was shamed. It would go into the presence of Pontius Pilate, where Jesus was condemned, to the place where Jesus was whipped and beaten. That perfume may have even been left as residue on the hands of those who gambled for his clothes at the foot of the cross. Like they pulled off some garment and said, "What's that smell?" And if you just let your imagination roll for a minute, in that final week, everyone who smelled the fragrance of Christ smelled the woman. And everyone who got close enough to get a whiff of the scent of that woman also smelled Jesus. And I imagine one of the religious leaders brushing by the woman in the streets or on the Via Dolorosa or whatever, and catching a hint of that perfume as he walked by and thinking to himself, I've smelled that aroma before. 2 Corinthians 2:15 says, we are to God the aroma of Christ. To some we are the aroma of death, and to others the fragrance of life. The woman at Bethany demonstrates to us that when we surrender to Jesus, we become like him in ways that will be recognizable to others. See, in our surrender, we're most identified with our Savior. So before Judas heads out on his treacherous quest of betrayal, Jesus says this remarkable thing. He says, I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her. And here we are today in 2025, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy. We're telling her story. And why was this act so memorable? Well, it was a picture of the gospel. Not only did her act point us to the cross and the burial specifically, and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus, but the story echoes the gospel's assurance that Christ welcomes anyone who comes to him in faith, in full surrender, no matter what onlookers might say or how unworthy a person may feel. As our big idea stated, surrendering to Jesus is worth whatever sacrifice it may cost. Now, for today's next steps, let me call you to 3 acts of surrender. Here's the first. Would you name your alabaster jar? Like this is your most precious thing, the possession, the relationship, the dream, the identity that you've built your life around. Would you even just write it down right now somewhere, maybe in your notes or on your phone? And just ask yourself honestly, like, has this become more valuable to me than Jesus? The second thing I'd ask you to do is to break the bottle. Like Jesus said of this woman, that she has done what she could. She gave me what she had to give. And what's in your hand? And take that thing and give it back to God. And so maybe it's a skill, maybe it's a gift, a spiritual gift, a possession, a connection, a platform, some finances. Like what do you have in your hand? Whatever it is, would you practice saying, yes, Lord? Because no, Lord, is an oxymoron. The third is to pour yourself out in scandalous surrender. So is there an area of your life where you've been hedging your bets with God, like keeping one foot in your old life? When's the last time you did something extravagant for Jesus Christ? Eliminated the safety net, something that made no sense by the world's math, something that left people shaking their heads. Those things are a sweet-smelling aroma to God. So what would an extravagant obedience look like for you? I don't know about you, but this woman at Bethany, this story challenges me. That I'm playing it too safe, that I'm too concerned with what other people think of me, that I'm not putting my faith out there enough. Remember how we started, those profound regrets people express at the end of their lives. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Well, the woman at Bethany shows us something profound, that the most authentic version of yourself is found in complete surrender to Jesus. What others calculated costs and managed appearances, she was breaking the jar. While they played it safe, she poured out her perfume. And 2,000 years later, we're still telling her story. You know, today you walked in here carrying your own alabaster jar. Maybe it's your reputation, maybe your comfort, maybe it's your need for control. But like everyone at that dinner party, you have a choice. You can play it safe, you can break the jar. Because here's the beautiful paradox. When you finally stop trying to live up to what others expect, when you finally stop clinging to your backup plans, when you finally pour out everything for Jesus, that is when you'll discover who you were always meant to be. The grace of Christ has been poured out for you again and again. His love for you overflows. And there's only one real response in the light of that kind of grace. 3 words. I surrender all. I love you guys.